Hey Amazon Prime members, why pay more for groceries when you can save big on thousands of items at Amazon Fresh? Shop Prime exclusive deals and save up to 50% on weekly grocery favorites. Plus, save 10% on Amazon brands, like our new brand Amazon Saver, 365 by Whole Foods Market, Aplenty, and more. Come back for new deals rotating every week. Don't miss out on savings. Shop Prime exclusive deals at Amazon Fresh. Select varieties.
This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast. We try and come to you daily with short business episodes, private equity episodes, try and give you a chance to learn something, hope we learn something, that you're entertained as well. Today, we're joined by the most brilliant person I get to visit with regularly, David Pivnick, who's a partner and litigator at McGuireWoods. We're going to talk today about two very different subjects. First, turnarounds. Are there translations from sports to business and a lot more? Talk about a lot of turnover going on recently. And then we're also going to talk about Lena Khan and the FTC and what happens if there's a change in administration. But David, the first topic is, we're seeing so many efforts currently at companies trying to turn themselves around. Jeep Stellantis taking it on the chin day in, day out, down 43% this year. They're getting rid of their CEO. Walgreens, a great company from the Midwest here that we're used to using their services in their stores, got rid of their CEO, brought in a new CEO. Similarly, CVS just replaced their CEO with somebody else from CVS. And whether you're at a small company or a large company, this need for turnover, it seems to be so prevalent. Challenges in trying to turn things around or move them in the right direction. There's a whole host of these situations this year. I look at, and again, you and I often come back to sports analogies. The Chicago Bears were so awful for so long, and it seems like in a very short period of time, their general manager has taken a very different approach. Don't go for making the offensive line perfect, rather go for greatness in the skill positions. Are there, and he seems to have moved the Bears in the right direction very quickly after it seems like 30 years in the desert, as they say. The same thing happens with mid-sized private equity-sponsored companies. They've got a leader, they turn over leadership. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Is it impossible to turn things around? Is it possible? Are there things to be learned from the sports analogy where it seems like the franchise has been taking the wrong tact on it for 30 years, and then suddenly either got lucky or took a very different tact, going for the skill positions versus the lines, and all of a sudden has a team again? What's your sense of this? Are there lessons to be learned here that can be transferred to business, or is this just sports and it is what it is?
Yeah, Scott, appreciate the opportunity to chat about it. The first thing I'll say, and I say this with a smile on my face, but I think it's so cute that as a Bears fan, you view it as a turnaround because you guys have won a few games early in the season before you get to the divisional games. I think one of the things that you mentioned there is setting reasonable expectations is really helpful on that front, because 40 years of the Bears being atrocious has clearly set the expectation that if they're even remotely not horrible for 1 month, people should be planning a parade. So kudos to Ryan Poles for that. More generally in the business, I'm going to stop you for
a second. I'm going to stop you for a second because I take umbrage to this. The Bears are 4-2. They look like they're en route to having a dynasty, and anybody that thinks different doesn't really belong on this podcast. Is not smart enough to engage with me. I'm going to give you a break today and let you tell us your thoughts on turning business. I start off by saying this is the brightest person I ever get to visit with, literally valedictorian of his law school class. And I feel like I'm quickly taking it on the chin here by being called cute for thinking the Bears are good. I'm offended. I'm going to get over it. I'm turning the floor back to you, David.
Yeah, no, I thought there was a risk that you might be offended. I feel the good news for me is in a couple months we'll get to revisit this after the Bears have played teams that aren't a cumulative like 6 and 1,000 on the season, and we'll see how it looks. But I do think the comparison to sports is a little tricky in the business context because in sports, unlike in business, you can really rip it down to the studs and start completely new. I mean, that's effectively what the Bears did They cleaned house. They kept very few veteran players around. I agree with you. They focused on the skilled positions, although they've added some linemen. But it really was a complete overhaul. It's what the White Sox are going to have to do now, although that's another franchise that I'm not even sure warrants discussion because it's so destitute. In a business, I think it's a little harder to take a sort of everyone must go, we're going to start again approach. And there's a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is the message that it sends to the market and the difficulty in keeping together the things that business might be doing well. But I think that's the key. I think the short answer to your last question of can this be done in business is yes. I think businesses can be incrementally improved where that's appropriate. And I think businesses can be, more generically overhauled as part of a turnaround where that's appropriate. But I think it still needs to be much more deliberate and incremental than in the context of a sports franchise. I think for a business, it needs to be the focus on, first assessing strengths and weaknesses. And it might be as simple as thinking that leadership is a big problem and a change at the top might be sufficient, that the core business lines are doing well and things are generally moving apace. It could be that there's changes in the nature of the business, over time. Companies like Xerox, which, at one point was very much a paper-based company based on what they were offering, and has now turned themselves over the last decades into a service-based company. There might be a pivot. So I think it's really assessing the market, figuring out what you're doing well and where you want to go, and then making appropriate changes. And so that could be a change in leadership, could be getting into new service lines, acquiring a business that complements what you're doing, selling off a part of the business that isn't working well. I think there's lots of pathways to get there. I think it's doable, but I think the key is a reasoned assessment, hopefully, with impartial folks involved at the top, board members and otherwise, and then starting to make the steps, whether it's changes in personnel, changes in the C-suite, or changes at some lower levels, changes at the head of a given division, to start moving things in the right direction.
Yes, it seems like at some of these big companies, they're making big changes. Walgreens, for example, turned over to the CEO. The CEO has very aggressively tried to remake the business back to its core, get out of a lot of the primary care business, the health system, trying to be a health system or a provider, and back to trying to be great at pharmacy and what they do on pharmacy, and then trying to grow from there. Also trying to, cut 1,200 stores to get the P&L back in line and bring the company back to profitability, but albeit on a shrunken footprint. And I guess there's a great example of both things, the strategy changing and the leader changing and sort of somewhat in line with each other. Other places, it seems like, the strategy, it's not so much strategy driven, or maybe it's a mix. It's CEO driven, and the CEO has driven a strategy that the board now hates or is really doing poorly in the market. So they're trying to change it. When I look at mid-sized private equity sponsored companies and they go through CEO transitions, it's often rocky as that gets started. Any thoughts about when you work with mid-sized companies, that you see changes in leadership, how long it often takes to see that sort of work through in the right direction to start to level itself out? And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I hate answering questions with it depends, but I do think it depends. I mean, a lot of the difficulty there may be bringing in someone who could be a great fit and smart and capable, but who's not familiar with the company, is coming in from outside, doesn't know the people, personnel, and strengths, and what makes the business great, and is going to have to figure out those things to go with their strong leadership skills. It depends on what you're trying to do. Elevating someone internally who already knows the culture and the business and might have some different skills than the person they're replacing, I think is typically a quicker process. But bringing in someone external who's got a bigger vision may not be bogged down in some of the things in the past that may not have been working as well, but they may have gotten sort of used to and stuck on. A new set of eyes could help. So I think the answer is it depends. And I think it could be a matter of a few months. getting a new leader installed who's familiar with the business, familiar with the industry, and can get things up and running in fairly short order, versus, someone coming in who's truly external and has great skills, but is starting new in a lot of ways. I think it take longer than a few months and be a more drawn out process, but often with potentially a higher reward as well, because they are going to be doing a more complete overhaul. So it depends, not without context. I think it depends a lot on how familiar the person is who's coming in, what kind of changes are being made, and how things are going to play out from there.
No, I think that's exactly right. And let me turn to another subject that we might handle separately in a separate podcast, but just ask you really quickly, Lena Khan and the FTC. I mean, it sounds like it should be a song, but she has been so forceful of a leader. What does it mean if there's a change in the guard at the White House? Does that mean that antitrust enforcement era is over, or is it, some of it will continue? What's your sense on some of that?
I think it's the kind of thing where assuming there's a change in the White House, I think there's likely to definitely be an impact on the strident nature of FTC enforcement efforts right now. I don't think it's the kind of thing that's likely to take place overnight, but I think it is fair to say, not stepping out of line politically or making any bold proclamation here, that former President Trump and potentially future President Trump is likely going to have a less regulations are good perspective. And so I think it will likely be a less strident enforcement environment if there is a change at the top in terms of the president, and we'll have to see how it plays out. I do think one of the things that may soften the impact of that is that various states are taking their own stances on antitrust enforcement and becoming a little bit more robust in their respective enforcement efforts, and some of that won't be impacted or walked back even with the change at the FTC. But I mean, the short answer is I don't think it'll be a quick reversal, but I think if there's a change in the presidency and the Republican, President Trump, we know who the nominee will be, obviously, if the nominee is, if President Trump is back in office, I think that we would expect to see a lower enforcement environment generally.
David, thank you for joining us today on the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast. It's been a fascinating time in terms of watching turnarounds with so many executive leadership moves and what it means for the rest of us. And also watching this with Lena Khan and the FTC. She's been a forceful leader there, the most forceful we've seen in a long time since the old trust busting days. And fascinating to see what happens if, in fact, there is a change in leadership. David Pivnick, one of the brightest people we work with, thank you for joining us today on the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Ever wonder what's driving political trends and policy decisions? Check out the Science of Politics podcast from the Niskanen Center. This biweekly show features engaging conversations with up-and-coming political scientists and explores the latest research on elections, public opinion, and policy, from the impact of social media on voting behavior to the nuances of legislative decision-making. The Science of Politics breaks down complex political phenomena into accessible discussions. Whether you're working in politics or simply want to understand the forces shaping our political landscape, this podcast offers fresh perspectives that go beyond the headlines. Subscribe to the Science of Politics podcast and join a community of listeners passionate about understanding U.S. politics. It's time to bring more science to your politics.